when you make an investment as a company, and I've been on the other side as well briefly, right? When you make an investment as a company, you really expect a very strong return on that investment, and it's difficult to measure ROI on some of these things that we do and the world that we live in. But part of the way that companies think about that is my problem is solved, which is probably a bit of an unrealistic expectation.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to a great episode of the Future of Data Security. We're in beautiful Washington, D.C. It's 25 degrees. Everyone's happy. And today we're lucky to have Orson Lucas. He's a cybersecurity partner at KPMG. Orson, thank you for joining the podcast.
It's awesome. Thanks so much for letting me talk with you today. And I was actually here a couple weeks ago too with my family, and was on the front end of the cherry blossoms. I guess we just missed it on the back end this time. It's a little too warm for it now, but it was pretty impressive.
Yeah, I
First
think
time.
the IAPP does it right after the blossoms fall. They probably get a better
I'm
deal.
sure they do. I'm sure that has something to do with it.
Fantastic. You've spent 2 decades at KPMG and obviously widely recognized as a leader in risk consulting. Major projects from global privacy compliance to cybersecurity programs, M&A, IT transformation for Fortune 500 companies. Maybe to start looking back on this great career, what made you want to join KPMG in the first place?
Yeah, I feel like I'm not really old enough to have a retrospective of my life at this point, but I guess it's the point in my career I'm at. But it's been a fun ride so far. So what caused me to join KPMG in the first place? Interestingly enough, I took another job. I accepted another offer immediately out of grad school, and happened to interview with a KPMG partner the next day. And really, I think what turned me on to it was my personality. I have a really hard time sitting still, right? I don't know if it's ADHD or, whatever it is, but really hard time sitting still and being able to just see something different every day, talk to new people, engage in different types of projects, really unique challenges that our clients are facing, to me is really rewarding. And, not only is what brought me to KPMG, but I think what really kept me here over the years. So I think it's a little bit of a cliche answer to say it's the people, but it really is, right? The people on our teams, but also the clients that I get to engage with and the unique problems I get to solve.
Really, what you're saying is there's never a dull moment.
There really is. Yeah, it really never is a dull moment here. I was telling you about my morning, just even coming in here with
Yeah.
probably 6 or 8 meetings, client meetings, and law firm partner meetings, internal meetings. It's just it's been a whirlwind, but it's been fun.
No, it's very good. Over the past 20 years in data security and privacy, what are some of the biggest shifts you've seen? And I think we're on the cusp of some even bigger shifts with AI, but what have you seen as some of these large shifts over the last 20 years?
Yeah, so I mean, a few things, right? I know you and I are both attending the IAPP conference here in DC this week, and attending around it. So lot of really interesting things being brought up there. A lot of talk around AI and the changes that are coming up. But I think the first privacy conference I attended was back in 2006, and I was joking about this yesterday with one of my colleagues, right? That I was doing privacy before privacy was cool, right? And kind of had an opportunity to get involved in the project. Back then it was around it was called State Bill 1386 or SB 1386, around breach notification for California. Since then, obviously all the other states have copied that, and then it's gotten a lot more intensive with the likes of GDPR and CCPA, CPRA, LGPD, the whole PIPEDA, all of that, the alphabet soup of privacy regulation. So I think to answer your question, one of the big things that's changed is that there's a lot more awareness around privacy, both through the lens of some of these regulatory drivers, but probably more importantly, I think there's a consumer awareness around the sensitivity of their information, whether that's thinking about it in terms of privacy or security. But when you look at the way that a lot of really unique and innovative companies are differentiating, it actually points back into security and privacy. So I don't mean to call out specific companies, but it's a very well-known thing, right? Apple, as they sell their products, you're not just buying a computer that has certain technical capability. You're buying something that helps to reinforce that they take your data seriously. They have privacy protections in place and things like that that are built into the product itself. So I think there's a really unique opportunity there for other companies, and this is something we've talked with companies across a variety of industries on automotive and others as well, to similarly differentiate around privacy and security as a core sort of business differentiator as opposed to just something that we do on the side because we have to because there's a regulatory requirement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think for a long while, a lot of organizations were kind of operating in a safe harbor, right?
That's right.
You could do anything you want with the data, even if it's not your data, it might as well be. I think there was a watershed moment with the Facebook Cambridge Analytica
That's right.
event. Do you see it the same way? Like, was there sort of a clear cut? Okay, guys, the party's over.
I don't know if there was a clear defining of. I mean, Cambridge Analytica was obviously a big one, but there were probably a number of others as well around data, just various different data breaches. New regulations came in. Various different lawsuits. Like there were a whole host of things that I think in aggregate probably contributed to that, as opposed to a single, you know, pre and post event kind of a situation.
And when you talk to clients, organizations, are there huge misconceptions or common misconceptions you run into when talking about data security, data privacy?
Yeah, I think one of the really fundamental ones that I see over and over again is that it's just a one and done kind of initiative. This is something that comes up with boards and audit committees in some cases as well, right? Where they'll just say, "Hey, our peer was breached, or even we had a data breach, and we know that we need to invest to bring things up to speed into a good standard of care." But they don't really think about it as a multi-year, initiative where they need to continue to invest to maintain that level. And over time, it tends to, trickle off, and ultimately they end up in a similar situation, if not a worse situation. There's a counter to that. There's a large retail organization that I work with that has really kind of bought into the idea that this is something that's important to continue to invest in over time. And really, as we look at their capability maturity today, in this case, it was relative to the NIST cybersecurity framework standard of controls. That even if they did the same thing this year that they do next year, that they do the year after that, ultimately their maturity is going to go down over time because the state of threats is changing and evolving, right? With vishing and smishing and other types of more AI focused attacks. That even with the same investment and the same controls, that maturity is going to go down over time. So you need to continue to invest in resources, continue to invest in new and innovative technologies, and frankly, creative ways of doing things as well to help to mitigate that risk over time.
And I think the expectations of the public are increasing year over year as well. People are like, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing with my data?
It's a weird dynamic, though, right?
Hmm.
Because I think people are kind of schizophrenic when it comes to that. I think in a lot of cases, right? And that sounds bad to say, but you look at the way that people message things, right? Like, yes, this is important to me. We actually did a corporate data responsibility survey out to it's around 2,000 consumers and a couple hundred companies. And it was really kind of an interesting contrast where consumers said, yes, this is something that's important to us. We take this seriously. It's something that we want you to invest in and take seriously as a company. But it didn't really change the way that they acted when there was a data breach. It didn't change the way that they acted when, the privacy notice changed and it talks about increased sharing of information with third parties. People just don't, there's a little bit of a bifurcation or disconnect between what people think is important and, what they actually do to show that it's important in the way they interact with companies. So that may change over time, but yeah, we certainly continue to hear that.
And of course, consumers wholesale scroll down all the T's and C's on many,
You
many.
don't read a 30, 40 page,
Of
terms
course, I
of service,
do.
do you? Okay. All right. Real quick on that, I will say
Yeah.
now there's really no excuse with AI to not just copy and paste it in there and say, tell me what you're actually, tell me the important stuff I need to know. Like there's no excuse at all not to,
Yeah,
understand it.
that's a very good point. I think a lot of people started doing that. I do it myself, even if we're going to review an agreement with legal. I like to quickly, hey, give me all the key points, and
Exactly.
it makes you smarter on some of
It
that
really
content.
does. Yeah. Or at least to hone in on what's important as opposed to, cutting through all the legalese.
All the onion layers that the lawyers put in there. You talked about the one and done, and a lot of organizations, board members have this magical thinking, let's just do it once. Of course, it doesn't pan out that way as you've talked about. But if there was one thing or a few things that have the biggest impact in an organization for data security or data privacy, what would these things be?
A lot of this comes back to sort of the fundamentals and what data security and privacy build on, which to me, first and foremost, is a good understanding and clarity of data, right? So what data do you have? Where is it? What are you doing with it? With whom is it being shared? And how is it protected? Are very simple questions to ask. Are very difficult questions to answer in practice and at scale.
Mm.
So, just being able to go out and build a clear, a picture of a clear inventory and footprint of where that data is and where it's transmitting from helps with everything from data localization laws that are in place. It helps with things like, so one of the things we're dealing with here in the U.S. recently with a lot of companies is the DOJ rule on the bulk transfer of sensitive personal information from the U.S. to certain countries like China and Russia, North Korea, et cetera. So, that the where companies are struggling with that, they haven't maybe invested in that enough historically, that inventory and that understanding of data flows. So going in and saying, do we have the right controls? They don't, you can't answer that question until you answer the question of what data is actually being transmitted back and forth and knowing how big of a risk exposure you have. So that first step of really just understanding what you have and where it's going, what you're doing with it is a really important and fundamental starting point. And then I think on top of that, classifying the information so you're able to start to whittle down, whether it's understanding record types or whether it's understanding certain sensitive data types, just putting some classification structure in place to be able to more consistently enforce rules around that, whether it's data loss prevention, whether it's encryption, whether it's anonymization or use of synthetic data. Again, all of that kind of fundamentally follows the first and second sort of parts in that process. So.
One of the things I've seen that doesn't tend to work very well is organizations that come up with this fantastic plan,
Yeah.
top down, it's perfect, but really nobody knows what's going on at the ground level. What's the ground truth? What's your views on that? And isn't there an optimal balance between what we could consider top-down planning? Yes, you need standards. Yes, you need something to be laid out, but you also need to know what's happening on the ground floor and across your various locations.
I think that's right, and I'm going to play out my 21 years of being a consultant here by using a consulting term that there's a tendency to boil the ocean, or at least to attempt to, with some of these initiatives. So when you when you make an investment as a company, and I've been on the other side as well briefly, right? When you make an investment as a company, you really expect a very strong return on that investment, and it's difficult to measure ROI on some of these things that we do and the world that we live in. But part of the way that companies think about that is my problem is solved, which is probably a bit of an unrealistic expectation. I think the reality is you're able to solve aspects of the problem in a sort of a risk-based and iterative way, but getting to completely solving the problem. So as we talked about, for example, the data discovery at scale across the entirety of the enterprise. I mean, you may have hundreds and hundreds of petabytes of data for a very, very large organization. The reality is there's no need to crawl all that data. You can think about that in more of a risk prioritized way to say, what are the most sensitive data sources that we have? What's the most sensitive types of data? Where the parts of our business that are most heavily impacted?
Yeah, you definitely don't win a prize for coverage.
Well,
although some people tend to collect these medals, it's more about risk reduction and
that's right. Yeah,
Right.
risk reduction, risk mitigation, and really balancing your level of comfort as an organization with risk, with the amount of money that you want to spend to mitigate it. That's something that use an example from a audit committee discussion that I had probably 10 or so years ago. So it was a much more immature board. They didn't really have technologists on the board and everything. But as we were debriefing the results of a cyber study that we did, a cyber assessment that we did, they're a very comprehensive one. We built out a roadmap for them and everything. And they said, well, what's this going to cost? And we're like, well, here's the number for it. And they're like, well, what if we want the risk to be zero? It's like, well, that's going to cost a whole lot more, right? So there's a risk acceptance that goes along with the investment and trade-off there.
Right. The only thing that's going to be zero is what's left in your pocket at the end.
That's exactly right.
Talking about the relationship between data privacy and data security.
Yeah.
On the one hand, privacy more aligned to the legal side, security obviously on a risk reduction. What are your thoughts on that, and how is it evolving?
What's really interesting, I think, is as we have a lot of these conversations with companies, it gets into what collaborative model makes the most sense for the organization to help to mitigate that risk. And so, in my view, both security and privacy are stakeholders as part of that conversation. But there's quite a few others that need to be at the table as well. So, legal, for example, in terms of interpretation of some of these regulations, horizon scanning, working through contracting issues, things like that. The chief data officer. So interestingly, a lot of the conversations I'm having, even with chief privacy officers now, point back to the idea that this is not a privacy problem. This is a data problem, a data governance problem. And if we get data governance right, then privacy, I don't want to say it solves itself, but it's a whole lot easier to solve. There's other stakeholders that are part of that too. So you think about employee data with HR, the marketing organization, right? The chief marketing officer as a do everything they can to try to increase customer engagement and deepen those relationships with customers. They need to make sure they're doing that in a way that is bounded by good guardrails that are security and privacy oriented as well. So it really is a collaborative effort. It's really a matter of understanding for those different stakeholder personas what the priorities are, and being able to normalize those into kind of a single organizational goal.
You get to work with a lot of organizations. If we're just focusing on those larger firms, let's call it 5,000 employees plus,
Yeah.
if you were to paint a picture of what you've seen works best as a structure between data privacy, data security, what would that look like?
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to clear lines of responsibility. So what I see most frequently, even with larger organizations, is privacy plays more of a second line role where they're setting policy, they're really laying out, even helping with tool selection in some cases as well, right? So they may say, these are the requirements, this is what needs to be built into the tool, these are the policies that are out there, but they're not the ones who typically own and operationalize a tool. A lot of times that's either the security office, potentially IT, and in some cases even first line stakeholders as well in certain industries. But really more of that first line, second line focus, and just more of a setting the tone for versus actually operationalizing the controls, even privacy tools and privacy controls, just given the overlap and intersect between the two.
I think from a triad, let's call it triad, data protection, data privacy, data governance, often governance and privacy are the poor childs when it comes to solutions and
Yeah.
technologies. Are you seeing a convergence? Are you seeing more collaboration amongst these stakeholders that often the technology can come in and benefit equally each stakeholders?
I think that's right. Honestly, I'd even take that a step further to say that the better practices and where it's easier to obtain funding and executive support and alignment is where you're building from a technology that you already have. So, as an example, right, if you have the security officer's gone out and bought a data loss prevention tool, right, to help with exfiltration of data, network data, endpoint data, whatever it is, and you don't want to invest in additional technology because you don't have the budget for it, rather than not doing anything for, let's say, data discovery to help to inform data subject right fulfillment, for example. Maybe you just the privacy officer teams with the security team to help to augment some of those rules from a DLP standpoint and scanning to help understand better what's out there. It's not a perfect solution, but just building from what you have, I think, is a point that I'm trying to make in terms of investment, in terms of organizational change management and adoption.
Do you think that recent budgetary pressures and organizations have had an impact on people getting more effective at that collaboration?
I think so. I mean, that's always a challenge. There's always going to be downward pressure on budgets. That's not going to change probably in my lifetime, but I do think that that's probably one of the big drivers around that. The other, though, I think, and especially in larger organizations, there's companies I work with that literally have multiple licenses of every tool out there, including some competing tools and licenses that frankly, if you look at it top down, doesn't make a lot of sense. But they just have different buyers, and they're so big, and all that it's all out there. Even in those situations, I think there's still benefits to building on what you have more from an organizational change management perspective, right? That people already understand, they already use this tool. Now, if we have to move all the data from that to another, train everybody in the new tool, switch everything over, change it, like it's a very sort of inefficient and very high friction kind of way of doing things as opposed to just building on what you have. So just to be clear, I think there's very much a case to be made for a fit for purpose tool for certain, use cases and that are very specific to privacy and security. But I do think there's also potentially some value to be had in building from the existing ecosystem that you have.
So even in mature organizations, there are some blind spots.
Mhm.
What are some of the most common ones you see when it comes to data security?
Mm.
Or we could say, what trends should leaders pay close attention to in data security?
That's a good question. So I think from a trend perspective, the types of threats, the types of attacks, as I mentioned earlier, I think are getting more and more complex, more and more targeted. So if you think about even just something like phishing, right, which many years ago was very scattershot, and someone would just send out an email, and maybe it hit, maybe it didn't. There's a lot more research that's going into those now. So I was actually talking with a client of mine yesterday afternoon on this, and she was saying that she was impacted by the California wildfires, and she was getting calls from somebody who said, hey, I'm helping with this, insurance situation, and everything, but they had a lot of information about her. They knew her address, they knew her permit information, like all of this stuff that seemed to credentialize that person as a legitimate thing. But as she started to press them on it, because she's very astute on this, she started to press them on it and said, hey, we're like, where are you calling from? Like, what about this? Are you on this street? And then they just hung up the phone. So what had happened was they were able to find all that information out through a public records request, right? And just looking out at the various different state websites and things like that to get all that information. So point being that I think, attackers are getting much more targeted. They're looking for higher value targets. They're using AI tools and other things like that to really come up with things that are very believable and very hard to distinguish between what's real and what's not. So trying to defend against that is a lot more difficult. There's certainly some tools out there that help you to distinguish between what's real and what's fake. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of the fundamentals around focus on human risk management, for example, and making sure that people understand what the risk is, the types of questions to ask, sort of a human in the loop, are really difficult to set aside at the end of the day.
We're going to talk about Gen AI in a moment. Strictly focusing on data security, do you make a distinction between unstructured, structured data?
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that and some of the trends and challenges in that space?
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying. I think solving for structured data is a lot easier and something that's probably a lot more, well defined in terms of the products that are out there. I think, I've been working with clients around identification management of unstructured data for years now, and it's just a really difficult problem to try to head off for a number of reasons, right? One is just the sprawl that's out there. Another one is ownership. I did some work with a large energy client probably 10, 12 years ago that had multiple different instances of SharePoint. They had NAS, they had multiple other file shares. Some of it was on premise, some of it was in the cloud. And then on top of that, they had, I don't know, something like 10 petabytes or so of sensitive information across all of those file shares. So you can run a tool against that and discover where all that information is. But in their case, the bigger issue is not the discovery of it. The bigger issue was what I'll call basically hanging access. So you had people who had left the organization that may have been owner of one of those folders that, you know, didn't transfer that ownership. So again, it comes back to data governance, right? Wasn't clear, who had access, whether they needed access, all that stuff, because basically nobody was watching it anymore. So like a lot of different challenges with unstructured data that aren't there with structured data that go well above and beyond just the ability to crawl the environment and discover that.
This is very interesting because as an emerging trend with Gen AI and in particular assistive systems
Yeah.
such as Copilot, not to pick on this one, but everyone knows about it.
Yeah.
These tools now have unfettered access to the same data source that a person has
Yeah.
access to. And generally speaking, the model isn't based on a new user account or system account for these systems. They will use your permission, my permission, your permission.
Exactly right.
And it's kind of interesting to think about. Previously, you might have had access to folders, but you're not spending all day perusing around.
Right.
But now the AI will. What's your thoughts on this? I would call it a new and unusual risk
Hmm.
that's bringing forth old risks that were always there. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I had a conversation with an energy client of mine, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago now, that had rolled out Copilot. And fortunately, they did it in a more of an iterative way, like I talked about earlier, as opposed to just a big bang, hey, we're rolling it out and everybody has access to it across the company. They had it rolled out to a limited number of folks within their IT organization, within their executive leadership team, just as more of a pilot, right, initially. But that was exactly the problem they ran into, was that people were like, oh, look at all the cool stuff this can do, right? Like, look at it, upload this, upload that, upload this budget form, upload that, whatever. And they hadn't really thought through how that impacted the training data that people were then able to go back and start to. So they stumbled across some of like the inference attacks or model inversion, those types of things in a very unintentional way, just by people going out and making queries and saying, wait, hold on, should I have access to this? And then it started raising some questions, and they went back and looked at it and said, yeah, we really need to make sure we've got folder structure lockdown and other permissions and things like that as well, what's being uploaded. So
It's very interesting because one of the benefits, of course, is these models, these agents are very flexible and dynamic,
right,
but it also increases the ways you can manipulate them,
that's right.
prompt injection, direct, indirect. Um, all very interesting. Are you seeing other types of risks being introduced? Perhaps one I hear a lot about, shadow AI.
Yeah, I mean, shadow AI is a real concern. I think there's some interesting tools out there. KPMG actually was a early investor in a company called Cranium that was one of. I mean, there's many firms out there, but that's one of the ones that we work most closely with. That helps not only with some of the aspects of AI governance more broadly, development of model cards and things like that, but also actually, and that, OneTrust is another. I know they have an interesting product as well that actually helps with some of the discovery of models as well. So, you can focus either on the training data sets and things like that from the data discovery perspective, or actually looking for AI models and things across the environment. But yeah, that's a very real concern. I think in the very same way that shadow IT was a number of years ago. It's ungoverned, it's unknown, and you have really no sense for whether or not you have the right controls in place and guardrails around it.
I think a lot of employees have a huge urge to use these tools
Yeah,
because they become more performant, they save time. A lot of people email themselves stuff from their work email to their
what are you
personal,
talking about?
or use their personal device if they work at home.
Yeah,
So there's that consumer pressure. And going back to what we talked about with Copilot, there's a lot of top-down pressure for adoption of these tools. They're going to make everyone more effective.
yeah.
We've talked about the problem. If you had some advices and recommendations, how should organization think about rolling out these tools? What should they do before?
Yeah, again, I'm going to put my let my consultant, nature here shine through, right? But I think one of the big things is not being the security group not being in the office of no, not KNOW, but NO, right? So in other words, your intent is not to shut down the business, but really to help to enable the business. One of the best ways you can do that around something like whether it's Copilot or use of other Gen AI tools is to roll out an internally managed instance. So we actually have that at KPMG. We have an advisory GPT tool to help to enable our advisory business that, by policy now, it's prohibited for people to go out and use ChatGPT, certainly with anything client-related, client data or use cases. But we have an internal tool that actually is internal hosted LLM that ties back out to the, for example, ChatGPT 4.0 engine or Anthropic or some of these other tools, or DALL-E code generation, things like that as well, but is all internally managed and hosted. So you're able to put that tight wrapper around it and make sure that all the right controls and guardrails need to be in place, and make sure that there's no unintentional data exfiltration that happens when people with all the best intents and trying to do the great things for the business are, maybe not thinking about the implications of what they do.
So, in other words, KPMG being a leader, you created sort of an enclave with all the best models. People use
That's right.
that. Are you, in addition, blocking some of the popular websites?
I don't, to be honest with you, I don't know, because I haven't tried to violate that
It's
policy.
all
But
trust-based,
I'd
right?
assume it's probably, I'd assume it's probably blocked. I do know that we have, standard DLP stuff in place and all that to prevent any exfiltration. But yeah, it's certainly good practice, right? To once you've provided a good internal option that help to enable people to drive the business forward, to actually block the other path. But if you block the other path with no other alternatives, people are going to pull out their personal device. They're going to do whatever they need to do to keep moving at the speed of the business.
That's when you find out about human ingenuity and Darwin.
Indeed, yes.
Third-party risk is a big deal right now. A lot of solutions are sprinkling AI, adding Gen AI on top.
Mm-hmm.
They're not necessarily asking for an opt-in. I think a great example that I can share is we're using Google Workspace, and
Okay.
some of these features kind of appeared in the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, to Google's credit, they have all the right safeguards and policies.
Right.
But I think it's difficult nowadays for people that already have technology and a new version comes out. Oh, look, there's a chat. Oh, look, there's this. And okay, what models are used? What data goes into it?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on this emerging risk and how organizations are going to think about third-party risk? And I'm extending it to end-party risk, frankly, because I
Right.
think now we have a long tail of risk
Right.
expanding.
Yeah, that's one of the really interesting challenges. I led a workshop yesterday at IPP, and this was a really, kind of interesting sidebar conversation that we had during the class was, when does the AI risk profile change enough that you would need to reevaluate, right? So is it when, for example, GPT 4.0 goes to GPT 5.0 as one instance, or is it when there's new product functionality that changes the risk profile? Like how do you identify what those thresholds or triggers are for the need to actually go out and reestablish a new risk baseline? But you're absolutely right, and I think one of the really dangerous things that we run into, and again, this goes back to the hey kids, review your terms of service to make sure you understand what's actually in there, not as just as a consumer, but as a business partner as well. Is there are some companies that actually will use that data that you provide for as training data for to help to improve their product, and I have to imagine, I haven't actually checked, but I have to imagine in those cases it's written into the contract. It may just be buried well within that or some interesting language wrapped around that. But, as a company, that's why it's so important to understand, how you're engaging, how you're interacting with that company, what data you're sharing, what protections are in place, and how that data is being used.
Do you have any thoughts on the whole base model argument? You know, companies are talking to me and our company about, okay, what base model are you using?
Mm,
Was it trained with fair use data? Because now all the biggest companies are lobbying, saying, we've used a ton of public data,
mm,
but this should really be considered fair use for competitiveness reasons. Any thoughts around that topic? And it's kind of a hot topic. It's unfolding, but I'd
mm.
love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, to be honest with you, that's not one I've run into a whole lot. I don't have too much of a point of view. I'm curious what you're seeing on that. Like, what are some of the challenges and better practices that you're?
Well, I hear clients say, we'd rather have you use models that are certified, where all the data that went into its creation was certified and is fair use. I think one family of models I know, and I'm sure there are others, is from IBM, the
Mm,
Granite family.
okay.
They went to great lengths to ensure that all the data, all the contents was free of any encumberment from a fair use perspective.
Interesting.
But without naming other models, I mean, there's a long chain of models out there that I've seen some of the court filings. This was the original picture, generate a similar scene, and it's
Right.
the same image. So there's definitely an argument out there for
Yeah.
copyrighted
I
materials.
say there's a lot around IP liability right now, and
Yeah.
it kind of goes back to understanding once it leaves your environment, is it your IP? How do you maintain those rights and everything around
And
it?
and so for us, specifically as a software provider, our question is when we choose models, if we build a business around a given model,
Mm,
we don't want it to be a liability in the future. Somebody comes back and say, well, that model was trained on our textbooks and all the IP that we have, and really you should pay us for that.
interesting.
So it's kind of an interesting question, right? That's why I say the end party risk or the long tail of risk that's potentially emerging
Right.
from the use of these models.
Yeah. No, so it's a really interesting question. I think one that and people always talk about, the laws and the legislation falling well behind. I think that's a great area there where a lot of this probably needs to be, adjudicated in the courts, and there be a precedent set. But very strong feelings, I think, around both sides of that right
You can tell me what you think of the record after.
now. That sounds good. Over a drink, right?
A lot of organizations have focused on data residency for a while.
Yeah.
I personally find it's a bit of a superficial check in a box to just say where's the data residing in an application or a use. I think there's so much more that goes into it. For instance, where's the software actually built,
Yeah.
who's writing it. And nowadays we would be justified in asking, is it written by a human?
Right.
Could be written by an AI, maybe supervised by a human.
Right.
Other aspects are the software bill of material, the
Yeah.
AI bill of material. What are your thoughts on this broader concept, really beyond data residency?
Yeah, I mean that you talked about a software bill of materials, a software supply chain. I think is a really important thing from a broader security standpoint, right? Is understanding where the code came from, what potential vulnerabilities there are. So I think it's been a pretty well known movement over the course of the past few years for a lot of even larger companies to invest pretty heavily in the open source area, right? In terms of just development of code and being part of those communities, but I do think that that's a really important thing to lean into. I think the data localization thing I think is being primarily driven through some of these regulations. So like the Schrems 2 out the EDPB in Europe, China I think is another big one that a lot of companies struggle with in terms of what they do we have to keep it within the country versus what can be shared and accessed externally. To me, that feels a little bit more like a check the box exercise for a lot of companies and not something that it's like, this is dramatically going to reduce our risk if we keep the data located in country X. It's more of a, we have an obligation to keep certain data within certain countries. How do we actually fulfill that? Whether it be, the cloud server that's hosted in that country or other restrictive controls that stop it from leaving the country borders.
There were a lot of incidents in the past few years, even this year, that implicated supply chain integrity,
Yeah.
supply chain assurance.
Yeah.
Data sovereignty as a broader concept beyond residency. Do you think people are paying more attention? Do you think it's becoming more of a legitimate risk topic, besides a checkbox exercise?
Yeah. I don't know that there's at least the consumer level, that there's been a ton of awareness yet around that. That may change over time, I think. And, obviously not going to happen. We talked about this last night, is to steer clear of politics, right? But there's a lot of churn and things like that within the current political environment that it makes it a little bit difficult to tack into where specifically things are going to go in terms of direction. So I think once that settles out a little bit, there's some more clarity there in terms of some of the new laws, in terms of some of just the sort of the new ways of doing business, et cetera, that may resolve itself.
That was a tough one. I saw you go through different iterations. Like,
I'm a politician
let's
too, I
keep
guess,
it
right?
politically correct.
Keep it politically correct. Yeah.
So looking ahead, what are your top predictions for how data security and privacy will evolve, say, over the next 5 years?
Yeah.
Any big predictions, big trends?
Well, look, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't include, AI somewhere in the mix there. So I do think that has a potential to change both the risk profile as well as the enablement of how companies, manage some of those risks as well. So the risk profile from the perspective of, there'll be new laws, new regulations, and trying to harmonize those, I think will be a challenge. I think the technology moving at pace that's faster even than some of those new regulations that are coming out is going to be a challenge as well. So I think in terms of risks, that those are kind of a few things that will come out there. But I do think there's probably equally some opportunities around that as well, that we haven't seen before. And even there's a lot of very strong hype cycle, I think, right now around AI. That every tool, every product has AI built into it, it's AI powered, et cetera. And I think that'll probably be the case for the near future. But the reality is, I do think there are some really true changes that are coming into place in terms of some of the tools that are being rolled out as well, that are more, we'll say, AI native, right? In a way that a lot of the legacy types of tools, even from 10 years ago, haven't been. So really exciting time.
Last one for you. And we were chatting yesterday. You've been 2 decades at KPMG. You know where all the secret gardens are. If you were going to give advice to someone entering that space in cybersecurity, in consulting, or even a younger version of yourself,
Yeah.
what would be some of your top pieces of advice?
I think one of the big pieces of advice that I got early on in my career from a mentor of mine that I really valued and that I think stuck with me is kind of keep your head down, stay focused, and just don't let the noise distract you, right? Which I think it seems very basic, but in a lot of ways it's been really helpful in guiding my career as well, because things are always going to change, right? From a macro political perspective, from a tooling and technology perspective, in terms of just the business environment, all that's constantly fluid and in motion. But just staying focused on what's your path? Where do you want to be? What's your North Star from a career development perspective? And just ignoring some of the noise around that's really important. I think, though, and maybe seemingly in conflict with that, but really in my mind, it kind of goes together, is being curious and being open to things that maybe aren't directly on that path that really help to enrich your overall sort of presence and professional persona. So as I think about, when I ran across privacy and really data security, 15 years ago or whatever it was in my career, I knew it was something that I wanted to continue to be engaged with for the better part of my career. But there were a lot of types of projects and engagements and client interactions and things I had that weren't really related to that. That, as I look back, were really instrumental in helping to build me into who I am today. So, stay focused and have a North Star, but also be open to different types of things that may influence your career in a way that you really never expected and make you a better professional.
Very interesting. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. If people want to follow up on your work, is there a website or a
Yeah,
location they
I mean,
should?
you can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way, or just kpmg.com/US and dig into our cybersecurity offering there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Orson.
Absolutely. This is great. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Fantastic.